Hello, Lambertville. This is Mayor Julia Fall and my business administrator, Alex Torpy. We're here to talk to you a little bit about the broad overstrokes of our budget introduction for 2020. So if you'd like more information, ultimately, we'd like you to go watch our full budget presentation. But here's sort of the stuff that we're going to cover in this particular presentation. We're going to go over basically the 6 highlights of the things you need to know. All of the more detailed information, like explanation of how we got to where we are today, the math to show how we got to our decisions and ultimately the options the city has moving forward, and a detailed account of the city's debt service is all in our larger presentation. We highly recommend that you go to lambertvillenj.org/2020 budget in order to get a fuller picture of what we're talking about here today. So, a very brief overview of the 6 things that you need to know about our 2020 budget. First of all, the city of Lambertville our financial situation has been deteriorating for several years. At this point, we know that we have significant oncoming tax increases between now and 2025, and everything that the city is doing is trying to mitigate those oncoming tax increases. Ultimately, we have some short-term problems that we've been able to fix between 2019 and 2020, but we need to start looking long-term in order to mitigate, again, those oncoming tax increases between now and 2025. We also are going to talk a little bit today about how vulnerable the city of Lambertville is to COVID-19 and why we are so concerned about what the tax impact of this pandemic is going to be. And then what the governing body has chosen to do in order to address that particular type of tax increase. So, Alex, is there anything that I've missed here?
No, I think you covered it all.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the background that we discussed beginning in August of 2019 about what the particular problem statements are for the city of Lambertville's previous budget.
So, we've got 6 different problems here, and really sort of 5 problems add up to the last one, which we'll spend a moment discussing. The first is the process for generating a fund balance or a surplus. That's the city's savings, and the way that was done in the past was not the traditional way. It didn't regenerate, and that amount has actually been depleting over time, getting lower and lower and about to fall below some critical levels. The second problem is the total amount of debt accrued, such that we're at a point now where almost a quarter of our entire budget is just paying our debt service obligations for money that we already borrowed many years ago. The third problem is the process for funding debt service and the lack of capital planning and the lack of budgets for capital projects. We've talked a lot about how we've tried to control costs in the capital realm, and that predominantly is reducing the amount of new debt authorized, which we did last year by about 97%, and also cutting costs out in different professional services areas that typically relate to capital projects. The fourth item is that there are a bunch of things that we've talked about in the past that annual expenses that we know the city incurs that are actually not budgeted for. And there's kind of a mad scramble at the end of the year with transfers between different accounts to try and find money to pay for things that we know we're going to pay for every year. The fifth is not keeping up with rising costs, whether that's inflation or whether that's raises for employees, some of whom have really fallen below what's competitive for Hunterdon County. And the last and kind of the biggest piece is the existence of a structural deficit or structural imbalance, which is basically just means that there is more money appropriated than there is money available. So that creates a gap, and we have to find a way to fill that in from somewhere.
Thanks. And I think it's important to note here that over 2019, we have brought a lot of these structural budget issues to life. And now we have to address those issues directly. And so within the 2020 budget, but ultimately in the longer term between now and 2025, we have designed this budget process to tackle the city's significant financial challenges and to ultimately to reduce the tax impact and the tax burden of some of these decisions that were made over the course of the last 10 years now. So ultimately, the goal of the governing body is to reduce our total tax impact of some of those decisions. So Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we are in a really problematic situation here with the finances and with the budget. If we don't implement some of the goals the mayor's talked about, we're going to see some really significant increases in Lambertville over the next 6 years. So much so that if the city continued at prior spending levels, that the average assessed homeowner, your taxes in 2025 would be $3,000 more approximately than they are today. Obviously, that is untenable.
And I want to stop here and just say that the goal here is to ensure that Lambertville remains an affordable place to live. And a $3,000 increase is not meeting that goal. And so while there are other issues that we also have to address as a part of this budget, we know that a $3,000 tax increase between now and 2025 is untenable.
And not only would taxes have gone up that amount, but we also would have depleted our surplus and reserves, which likely would result in a credit downgrade, which increases the cost of borrowing and also creates extreme risk to taxpayers in the future. It's one of the reasons why we're so vulnerable right now, which we'll talk about in a minute, because we really don't have a cushion or a savings account to be able to draw money from during an emergency like we're in.
So I want to, in the conversations that we've had in 2019 and through this year, you've seen sort of the 4 different ways that a government can address significant shortfalls, like the one that we're in right now. Unfortunately, because of the financial crisis that already existed prior to COVID-19, cutting operating budgets simply won't do it. The city has been employing multiple strategies to address both our structural deficit as well as a pandemic like COVID-19. But even if before COVID-19, if we cut every employee in City Hall, it wouldn't serve to fix the gap between our appropriation and the actual amount owed. So it's really important to note here that cutting and tightening our belts is not going to be the way that we ultimately solve these issues.
And even though we've made some changes from an efficiency standpoint, whether it is taking advantage of state programs to replace inefficient light fixtures with LED light fixtures that will reduce utility costs, moving to new phone systems that reduce telephone billing costs, those things all help a little bit. But the biggest pieces that we've talked about in the past, the real cost drivers, are the capital spending and the professional services that we've really brought down the spending in. But as the mayor said, that won't add up to the full picture.
So we set out some goals within the beginning of this budget process in 2019 of things that we would like to see within this budget. One of them, and I think this is really important to highlight here, is that we are stopping the irresponsible budgeting practice of borrowing more than we can afford in order to pay existing debt service payments. And so we're really excited about being able to address that problem head on this year. And we've also done some other work in order to fix the 2020 budget and start to address some of those structural financing issues. However, ultimately, we still have a structural deficit that will last for years past our 2020 budget, which is what we're going to continue to talk about today. Alex, is there anything else you'd like to address that's what's included in our 2020 budget?
Yeah, do you want me to run through kind of the list of items
Please.
here?
Yeah.
So in addition to those pieces, we've also started to reverse the trend of our surplus and fund balance being depleted, which again is really important. Ideally, over time, we actually want to build that up so that we have a savings account or a rainy day fund that can help us if we do encounter a revenue shortfall in the future. We are able to spread the reserve for debt service 1 additional year than what we had originally thought. This does include full health benefits for staff now. So that includes prescription and dental benefits, and just a few small raises for key staff that have really been underpaid for too many years and are just not competitive with salaries and wages for these positions in municipal government in Hunterdon County. This budget does include the absolute most critical capital spending, but it does not include high, medium, and low priority capital spending. If you're wondering what the difference between those two things are, is the average for the last few years prior was about $1.5 million a year in capital spending. We're bringing that number way down to about $150,000. So it's a huge reduction going forward, at least for the next few years, making sure we're not sending too much more money out the door, and just addressing the most high priority needs as we sort of get our footing over the next couple of years. We also have included in this budget every expense and charge that we believe we are likely to incur throughout the year. This was something we had mentioned before that was not included in previous budgets. And this also includes some assumptions for future ratable or revenue development to help ease the burden on existing taxpayers. Do we want to jump into some of the numbers here?
Yeah, so before we started really digging into our budget for 2020, we expected that to accomplish all of those goals would require about a $300 tax increase between 2019 and 2020. And our finance team, which includes myself, our business administrator, the CFO, our bookkeeper, our redevelopment attorney, and our bond attorney, we decided that was too high for a jump for this year. So we tightened our belts and figured out a way to produce a budget that hit most of the goals that we needed to hit for 2020 while reducing the total tax impact. And so what we came to was basically about $59 of tax payment for just debt service, and then $82 or close to $83 in a tax increase to for other needs outside of debt service, which would equal about $141 for the average assessed home. And now that was before the COVID-19 pandemic really started. And so, Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about what those changes look like and why we're so vulnerable to COVID-19?
Sure. So the first most important point is that too much of our revenue comes from non-tax sources. We get revenue from two places: tax and non-tax revenue. Non-tax revenue is inherently unreliable and variable. In Lambertville, the amount that we get through taxes, about 47%, is lower than most of the communities around us and lower than what it should be ideally, as those tax payments tend to be more consistent. Number two is that within that non-tax revenue, about half of that is especially variable revenue. So that includes things like court revenue, parking meters, construction fees, and fire prevention fees. And that basically means that on a highlight weekend in Lambertville, if we have bad weather and not enough people come to park and we lose parking meter revenue, that actually has a tangible impact on the city's budget right now. And that's important to understand and be aware of. Number three is that the city's surplus has been depleting for most of the last decade and is already dangerously low. So we don't have a savings account or a cushion that we can draw money from to tide us over during difficult times. And number four, almost a quarter of our entire budget is one fixed cost that we have no control over, and that is debt service.
And so prior to COVID, we were expecting about $141 tax increase on the average Lambertville home. Unfortunately, because we are so vulnerable to a issue like COVID-19, because so much of our appropriations are based on revenue that is variable, we've seen a significant revenue shortfall as well as an appropriation increase to deal with the COVID-19 issue. So understanding that, we are anticipating about a $213 tax increase for every average assessed home in order to deal directly with the COVID-19 crisis. So that would mean that this year we would be introducing a $354 tax increase to every home. Now, we went to the City of Lambertville's governing body and discussed this openly in public, what we should do in order to mitigate the pain this year. Because so much is unknown, because we are actively advocating directly with the state and federal government to help us with local aid, with federal aid for small municipalities to try and mitigate some of these costs, particularly around the revenue side, the governing body agreed that the best course of action was to push off that tax increase until 2021 and keep our current 2020 budget at the pre-COVID-19 levels. And then next year to deal with the total cost of what the COVID-19 ramifications would be. Alex, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth mentioning a couple, just two maybe additional things. One is that, our estimates for the impact of COVID-19 are sort of the best that we can do at this point. This is really difficult. We've gotten very little guidance from the state. A lot of municipalities are struggling trying to predict what things are going to be like 1, 2, 6 months from now. It's really difficult to do. The second is that the mayor, myself, other members of the governing body, there's a lot of work that's happening that is advocacy on behalf of Lambertville to state and federal stakeholders to try and find solutions to help municipalities, especially ones our size. We don't know. We don't have any guarantees of any help. Help might even be unlikely. We are advocating for it very aggressively at all of those different levels of government, but we just wanted folks to be prepared that if we don't get that help, which is very much possible, that is what things could look like for this year and then for next year as well.
Yeah, and I want to say that partially one of the things that we have to really consider in the short term is that governments don't work in the short term. We are not an institution that can think 2, 3, or 4 weeks ahead. We have to think years in advance, which is one of the reasons that we produced this new budget process and why we're talking about potential tax increases in 2021 all the way through 2025. We want to make sure that any chance that we have to mitigate tax increases, that we attack those chances, but ultimately with international pandemics like COVID-19, there's very little that we can do. So as you said, we're advocating with state and federal agencies, but ultimately we don't know that help is on the way, and we want to make sure that we have an open conversation with the public about what that means for our budget, not just this year, but in years to come.
And we'd certainly think that as we wrap up here, that if folks want to get more into the details, this has been the quickest possible summary that we can provide. And we do go into everything and provide those backup materials the mayor mentioned before. You can get all of that on the website at lambertvillenj.org/2020 budget. And we do encourage you to check all of that out.
Absolutely. And you can actually go through, we'll also post a spreadsheet with all of the various scenarios that we went through in order to mitigate some of those tax increases that we discussed today. We encourage you to dig into the details with us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next public hearing. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.